Welcome back, everybody, to the next room. Our next speaker is another alumnus of the department, and this is Dr. Ailey Bedford. So I think Ailey was one of the first people I actually met when I was a new undergraduate in Cambridge on my very first day as an 18-year-old, which is a little while back, not that very long ago, when we started as new undergraduates together. So it's a real personal pleasure, actually, to be introducing Ailey today.
Likewise.
Ailey is the Chief Technology Officer at Pall Life Sciences. She's led many product development teams over her career, and in the last year has been doing some really, really important stuff in terms of fighting COVID and the pandemic. So over to you, Ailey, and we'll hear what you've been up to.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really a delight to be here, actually. I'm really excited. And as Ruth said, from this talk, we're going to go from space back right down to Earth with a talk that's very much focused around industry and the versatility of material science across a whole number of different types of product development. I should say a word about the background, hopefully, on my picture. Normally, I'm located in Boston, but at the moment, I'm on vacation on Cape Cod. So we're going to hope that the internet lives up to the high-tech nature of this conference. So a word about me, and thank you so much for that nice introduction, Ruth. I did my PhD and my undergraduate in Cambridge in material science, and I really loved the material science department. I have to admit it was primarily for the people. I very much enjoyed the polymer group that I was a part of, and I really enjoyed the discussions that we had in the tea area. I think that gave me a lot of confidence. But I also really enjoyed how applied material sciences across so many different important products. So no surprise that I went into industry immediately after my PhD, into Unilever, working on things like a shampoo, skin creams, and laundry detergents. After about 10 years, I wanted to sample startups and went to the US into drug delivery startup, working with Bob Langer, who's one of the founders of Moderna. And then found my way back into cosmetics, into chemicals for a little while, into things like reinforcing materials in car tires and also in high-speed inkjet inks, a product that doesn't sound like it, but it's so complicated that Alan Wendell said, oh, this is just a miracle it works at all. I don't think I can help you with that. And then finally to where I am now, working in filtration products for purification and separation of things like drugs. So, given that broad background, I thought, well, maybe what you'd be interested to hear from me isn't so much a deep science talk on any of those areas, but perhaps how material science is really versatile across a lot of different stages in the product development process and around a lot of different types of products. And I thought maybe for students sitting in the audience, that was perhaps just good information that material science really is your friend. Then I think it is important to deep dive onto at least one thing. So I'm going to talk about virus filtration membranes, partly because they're what I'm working on now, but also partly because in a way they're a bit of a hidden hero in the pandemic. They do play a very important role in the production of vaccines. And then finally, I'm going to end maybe on a slightly provocative note with new materials are so important and it takes a long time to commercialize them. So the question, why does it take so long and what can we do to accelerate that process? So product development. Well, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to ride in a bike ride for myeloma from London to Paris. It's a 4-day ride, 300 odd miles with a lot of climbing. I'm not very athletic, so I will tell you that one of the things that it took was a very expensive titanium alloy bicycle, and I know a lot of people would appreciate that material here. But another thing it took was a lot of grit to actually get to the finish after the exciting vision at the start. And as I rode along, one of the things I was thinking, as well as why on earth did I come, was that that's a bit like the product development process, the process that you go through when you make any product, whether it's a cosmetic product or an electronics product or anything else. There's a period of preparation, there's the exciting start, just a whole load of executing the project, the execution phase, Quite likely there's prototyping, which usually leads to some sort of failure analysis. And also quite likely there's a need at some points to obtain outside help, whether that's in the fancily termed open innovation of working with universities or whether it's working with consultants on some of that failure mode analysis. And then finally, at the end, with a bit of luck, the celebration of the product is launched. And what I think about is that material science is very important across each of those areas and really can make the product development journey easier for a whole range of different products. So just a couple of examples what I mean by this at a really rather superficial level. At that preparation stage, a lot of times you're thinking about what material to design for a particular application. And so translating what the customer needs into the material properties. And that was something that I learned throughout my materials degree and PhD. And that's been something that I use every single day. For instance, in thinking about if you're developing a shower gel, maybe not the most high-tech of products, but when you do that, you're thinking about, do I want this shower gel to be creamy feeling? Do I want it to give a nice, refreshing, slightly more draggy feel? And to get that feeling, you think about the rheology. Believe it or not, something that you want a creamy feel, you'll give a material with a high normal force rheology, whereas something more draggy and refreshing, you have a negative normal force rheology. And so, of course, that takes you to the polymers that you might develop. It's the same kind of process that you go through with thinking about reinforcement for a car tire or spreading properties of an ink to give you a particular optical properties. It's the same steps of materials design, very much based on the principles in the Mike Ashby textbook, which is one of the fundamentals for me. I don't need to tell this team about materials characterization, but through a product development process, again on any type of product, thinking about how the material, not very scientific terms, but lives and breathes, how you characterize that material is incredibly important. And then often as you do that through the process, you need outside help through the testing of prototypes. And that can be pretty simple. So friction of hair can be tested through salon testing. But testing of, say, the properties of something on a silicon wafer for electronics is really hard. If you're in a smaller company like mine, having access to fabrication stations is just not going to be possible. So we work with outside materials areas such as IMEC here in Belgium, where they have that kind of facility that you can do the testing. And again, as I develop filter products today, testing those properties, making sure that they don't fail in use and perhaps lets bacteria or virus into the customer product, we do through materials testing with small materials consultancies in Cambridge, both the US and the UK, and they're an enormously important part of the process. So material science is important across a whole range of different products. And at many different stages of the process, it really is fundamental to product development across many different types of product. But I know that's very superficial. So let's just think about one product and the story of one product, if you like. And that's a virus filter. And that's one of the products that I work on now. So what is one of those? Well, the gentleman on the right, whoever he is obscuring a beautiful wall of these products at a research centre for vaccines in Edinburgh. A virus filter is used for filtering, not surprisingly, viruses out of pharmaceutical product, either a biotech gene therapy type product or a vaccine. And those viruses might come from extraneous sources in production, or they might be connected with the manufacture of the vaccine, antiviral vectors, for instance. So how does that virus filter come to be? Well, starting right back from the beginning, I work for a company called Pall Corporation. And we were founded by a Canadian metallurgist called David Pall. And he worked in the Manhattan Project on uranium enrichment. But when he left the Manhattan Project, one thing perhaps isn't well known is that the scientists were allowed to take their patents home with them. And so he used his patents to start a business from his garage as an entrepreneur in Queens, commercializing metallic filters for aircraft landing gear. And that was one of the first sets of filters used in that industry. However, family tragedy struck, his wife got leukemia, and so he then was inspired to invent the first leukocyte filter, and then into filters for biopharmaceutical products that we work on today. Today, the company is a large global company, provider of filtration and separation technology, both things like filters that I'm showing at the bottom here, and then larger biomanufacturing technology such as bioreactors. And then more recently, we acquired a company and make lipid nanoparticles that are used to transmit the RNA in the vaccine. We're acquired by Danaher in 2015, a very large corporation that you probably know better as the owner of Leica microscopes and also Beckman Coulter centrifuges. So what about the material though? Enough about the company. So a filter consists of a polymer membrane, so enormously similar to what I worked on in my PhD in polymers in Alan Windle's polymer group. It's porous membrane that separates out the things that we don't want in a customer fluid, like a virus or a bacteria, through size exclusion, and also through chemical means such as charge and other methods. I'll be interested to see, actually, there's one of the startups presenting later is on separation membrane, so I'm excited to see that. You can tailor the particular membrane to application. I don't know, just incredibly similar process to Lindsay was describing to metals, by tailoring the material, the polymer, metal, ceramic, the morphology, what the pore structure is, and then of course the surface chemistry that you might do through organic chemistry or energy sources. And there are obviously a lot of different ways of making a membrane. We use the phase inversion process, tailoring the phase diagram, but you can also make them by biaxial stretching or melt blowing, a process very similar actually to the carbon nanofibers from the materials department, or a wet lay process like paper. And which of these you would use and choose is driven by the customer need. For instance, PTFE you'd use in the most harsh environments. And so whether you're looking for something to not shed particles into the fluid, to be sustainable, resistant to different fluids. So what of this virus filter then? Well, it's used for processing biotech drugs, and obviously has played a large role in the pandemic, both in the pharmaceuticals and also in the production of the vaccines themselves. It's a membrane that has to remove both small, large, non-enveloped viruses, so a range of different particles, but as it does that, it mustn't bind the drug. And it should do that with a high flux. If you think about the amount of fluid being processed in the manufacture of vaccine around the world, then you need a filter that transports that fluid quickly. The process of making the filter, we use a materials design cycle. The same for really any other material and any other materials-based product. So we think about the application, what we need to design the filter to do, therefore, the fluid flow, the porosity, the size of the membrane, and we use computation to do that, and then into the chemistry structure that we need to develop. Onto the specific then. In the case of this virus membrane, just for interest, because I can't be part of a materials talk and not give some micrographs of the product, we make a membrane that's very asymmetric. So it has a large pore size on one side, but very small on the other, so that it can transmit the fluid quickly, but retain over 99.99% of a particular test virus. We use a particular pleating design of the membrane itself to get as much membrane in there as we can, and a specific surface chemistry which both binds to the membrane and makes it hydrophilic, so that the customer can wet the filter and test it for integrity in use. And you can see that those properties make it enormously important for vaccines. And so in my job for the last year really has been to get this membrane where it needs to be as quickly as it possibly can. And I say that because I suspect a lot of us in this room have been involved in similar over the last year. Material science has been very important in battling COVID-19. Just some of the other things that the company has been doing in the fight against COVID-19. And I show these not really so much for, hey, what my company's been doing, but I think probably a lot of people in the room have been doing similar. We don't talk about material science too much in its role in the pandemic, but it has been incredibly important. For instance, one of the things my company was involved in was on the production of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. We were part of the consortium that scaled that up. And in fact, the scale up of the vaccine was first done in our labs in Portsmouth, something that we're incredibly proud of, and which I have to say the US news was incredibly incredulous that the small laboratory in the south of England, as they put it, could possibly have done this. We also work on medical filters for breathing applications. And so one of the things we've been doing there, obviously, is just scaling up the amount of breathing filters that we make to go into ventilators. But something our engineers did early on in the pandemic is we had a brainstorm virtually of as many engineers we could get hold of across the whole company. And people were working in their sheds or wherever they could to figure out how best to use these breathing filters for some of the very sickest patients, where the fluid coming from the lungs is very difficult to filter, and you have to filter it to protect the doctors and medical workers in the hospital. So the very important application, and then we're able to work with hospitals to really give them advice what to do. Of course, we're working with the aircraft industry on supplying air filtration for anyone that was flying, and also providing manufacturing equipment to the biopharmaceutical industry, for instance, sterile filters, and also the virus filter that I mentioned. So an awful lot of work around the pandemic. And as I said, I think a lot of companies would have been involved in the same kind of activity, with normal R&D slowing down and production around COVID taking the lead. And I suspect many other people in this room could tell the same kind of story. Now I'm going to be a bit provocative. So that virus filter I talked about, of course, that wasn't developed last year. It was developed over a number of years and happened to be just in time available to use as the pandemic hit. And that's because it takes a long time to develop a new membrane, and it takes a long time to pull new materials into a membrane, or indeed into any product. And yet we really, really do need new materials. Things like sustainability, increasing regulation, being able to give new benefits, for instance, specificity. If you think about a membrane, you might want to take out some particles, but leave others. You might want the membrane to be particularly clean, not shed into the fluid. And of course, other products have exactly the same kind of drivers for new materials and needs. So new materials are really important, and industry and academia come together on that. Some of the things I look at include surface chemistries, graphene, nanofibers, porous polymers, and a lot of work around directed assembly to get different kind of pore structures. But commercialization of those new materials is slow, and I can probably feel people squirming in their seats as I say that. And the reason it could take 10 years to develop a new material into, say, a membrane. And even existing materials could take years to develop into a product extension. And of course, not everything is successful. And so there's a lot of challenges. One of those is around identifying the right customer need, so the material finds its niche. Translation of those needs into material requirements, what I talked about at the beginning. And then transfer from that lab stage into full production is very time consuming as well, and has a lot of failures along the way. And then finally, making sure that whatever product, in my case a membrane, is robust to the rigors of both being processed and also customer use. If you think of something like a virus membrane, then the defects in use might be very interesting to study, but they're certainly not our friend. And so making sure that we don't cause defects through manufacturing and that it can stand up to rigors in use is very important and takes time and testing. So how can we accelerate this process? Because I think all of us, whether industry or academia, want to bring new materials to market. And at this point, hopefully, you're at the edge of your seat. But unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand, and I wish I did. But I do think about two things which help us in that process. And maybe they're not what you would typically think, but I think give an industry perspective of how we can come together to accelerate materials development. One of those ways is around identifying customer need. Why should the customer care about any of these new materials or indeed new products? And I think here, the thing that makes power is in the combination of the material science and then turning that into what the customer needs around it to do. So we think about a process that we call problem to portfolio, where we're looking at a market, but then the problems that customers have in that market that can be addressed by our material science. We then challenge that in our teams, go through prototyping, using metrology, building insight and testing with customers, and through a repeated prototyping process, come to a product that we think has a good customer need. The photograph here shows some of our engineers looking at a product being used in use. We built user experience laboratories around even our filter products so that we can see people using those and understanding if there's something that's going to be needed. And I think this is an area where industry and academia can come together to make sure that materials are being flown through into the right kind of products, that the material fits the application. The second place is that in speeding the materials discovery and development into products itself. And of course, things like artificial intelligence, things like high throughput and computation are really important there. But also what we think about is having the right team. And I know that sounds very easy to say, aligned with the right process. So the process that we go through when we develop a product, whether it's using a new material or an old one, is something called quality function deployment, where you start with the actual needs, you take it down to the material requirements, and then into the processing that's going to be required. And if you think about it, that's exactly the process of designing a material. And so it's very, very suited to that part of product development. We also think about doing very strict project management. And in fact, we just use Post-it notes on a board and move those around in something that we call daily visual management. It's a way of bringing teams together. We make sure that we have the right team. So you could think about someone from academia on that team with new material, plus manufacturing, the product development team, and so on. And then also really, really important, which is one place I think this department really comes in, is in the what I call the science of the scale-up process. Making sure we understand the products from the resin through to what we're doing in the lab, prototypes, pilot lines, and so on, and that we're using good computation and materials characterization around that so that the product can efficiently come to market. And I think this process is how academia and industry can come together to commercialize new materials for important customer need-driven applications quickly. So finally, just in summary, material science really underpins product development across a lot of different industries. And I think that's something I just really like students to take away. There's an enormous abundance of places where material science is applied and is important in the product development process. There's huge unmet need for new materials across a wide range of applications, as we all know. So the future for anyone on the right-hand side of Lindsay's chart is really bright and needed. But commercialization is tough, with a lot of failures along the way. I don't have a magic wand as to what makes that more efficient, but good process and cross-functional teams and the right infrastructure do bring new materials and new products to market. And there's an example of that, just in time, as I put it here, advancements in material science, for instance, in our filters, but I am quite sure along a lot of other areas as well, have honestly played an outside role in COVID response. And I think everyone in this room can be really proud of that and the role that material science has played in the pandemic. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Ailey. That's absolutely fantastic. We have some questions already. James Elliott, who you know, of course,
I do.
says, thank you for the amazing talk and good to hear how materials, especially polymers, are helping with the COVID-19 response. He says, are there any major differences in structure and properties of viral filters in liquid state for vaccine manufacture and gas state, for example, for air filters?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. So we focus mostly on liquid filtration, but we did look actually at the start of the pandemic on mask materials, which obviously air filtration. And air filtration is mainly happening through electrostatics and the adsorption of particles to the surface of the filter or into somewhat of the top layers. So it's somewhat of a different mechanism. It's not quite so size exclusion based. And that's a good thing because obviously the pore size in a normal mask filter is much bigger than a virus particle, but that's one of the ways that they can be somewhat effective. So yeah, it tends to be quite a different mechanism, James, and happy to talk about that further.
Okay. Well, questions are coming in. So one of mine. So, as COVID hit, obviously that was a very sudden and a very pressing need. And have we still got you, Ailey? Yes. I think you can still hear me.
Yes.
Good. You talked about having products that were pretty much ready to use. Can you talk more about your experience there of reacting suddenly to something where the need wasn't necessarily as predictable as one might have expected?
Yeah, it was crazy, and I'm sure for everyone working here it was just as crazy. So first of all, everyone's at home, and then there's trying to determine what the need actually is. So as I mentioned, we first of all started looking at masks, which would be an obvious one for our materials, but we soon found that they weren't actually perfectly suitable. We started working with Oxford through an entrepreneurial manager in the company, donating some equipment, and so that took us in that direction. So I think it was a lot of very entrepreneurial steps, but with a huge momentum of the scientists around it, looking at the different areas that we're involved in. And now in the process, we're very much into the operations world of scaling up materials, just building capacity, getting materials where they need to be. So still equally crazy, but with a slightly different focus. And one of the things I would say in that early stage was the application testing. So what products are going to fit what application, what's going to be useful to helping breathing filters, for instance. That's a lot of materials testing. So a lot of that materials understanding stage was around this time last year.
Wow. So John Wood says, you briefly mentioned open innovation as first articulated by Henry Chesbrough. It seems to be suited to some industries and not others. Could you comment on how it has helped your area?
Yeah, sure. So we do look at new materials to give us new functionality onto our filters. So surface chemistries, for instance, actually the surface chemistry on the membrane that we talked about came from a university collaboration. We don't find it easy. Medium-sized companies like ours was, as it grew, was developing technology in its own right. So it termed a technology driver. And in that case, it's harder to interact and to bring in technology from outside. Those sorts of companies are very protective of their own technology. But as a company matures, bringing in technology from the outside becomes a much more mature process. It is challenging, but it's something that you can create process around.
Well, we have more questions coming in, but I think, given the time, we should probably call a halt there. Thank you very, very much, Ailey. That's amazing and really, really important work. You couldn't be doing anything more important in these.
I think lots of us have been. So thank you very much, though. Thanks for the opportunity.